Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today, we're jumping right into what is essentially a systemic autopsy of a national care curriculum. We're looking at the very system that handles separated children, aging parents, people at the absolutely thinnest, most vulnerable moments of their lives. But as you'll see as we unpack this today, this system structurally erases the origins of the exact people it's supposed to serve. So let's start with a number. Over $54.5 million. That's the Commonwealth budget granted every single funding cycle just to keep this national care curriculum fit for purpose. It's paying to train the workers who handle our most vulnerable people. And yet, there is a glaring omission here. Nowhere in that massive, multi-million-dollar investment is there a mandate to teach workers that a person has an origin worth keeping. Or, honestly, that identity rights even exist in the first place. If you're an adoptee or a separated person, you probably know exactly the kind of silence I'm talking about. You mention your severed origin to a care worker, and nothing. Their face just goes totally blank. But here's the central paradox of this whole explainer. That blank expression? It's not individual cruelty. That worker isn't just being callous or uncaring. No, that blankness is a funded, mandated, systemic omission. As the source material so perfectly puts it, the blankness has a budget.
Which brings us to Section 1, Blankness with a Budget. Okay, so let's break down exactly what that $54 million grant is maintaining, because its reach is literally staggering. It funds the CHC Community Services Training Package. This one single package credentials almost 1 in 5 Australian workers. We're talking about 3.22 million people across early childhood education, aged care, and disability support. Millions of workers are being trained to support well-being without ever being taught that, for forced adoption survivors and separated children, an original identity is something that can be structurally taken and absolutely must be preserved.
Let's move to Section 2, the Omission Audit Results.
So, you might be wondering, just how bad is this gap? Well, let's look at the forensic evidence. The omission platform ran a rigorous audit, version 2.2.1 to be exact, to meticulously quantify this structural blindness. And the consistency across the board is just dismal. They assessed 3 foundational qualifications against survivor-centered rights domains. Early childhood scored a 22.8, individual support got a 23.8, aged care came in at 26.9. That averages out to a 24.5 out of 100 across the entire human lifespan of care. And let's be clear, this kind of uniformity across sectors isn't just a drafting accident, it's a deliberate property of the schema itself. This really hits the nail on the head regarding the depth of the problem. If we look at the early childhood qualification, it produces a massive 68-point governance blind spot. On paper, the system projects this incredibly confident institutional compliance when it comes to inclusion and diversity. But in reality, that confidence completely masks a massive failure of the second a graduate encounters an adoptee child. I mean, they literally cannot see what they haven't been trained to look for.
And right here is the most crucial, honestly chilling metric. Of all the domains audited, the absolute lowest was identity continuity, scoring a 12.6 out of 100. Let that sink in. A 12.6 means our national training system produces practitioners who have literally zero framework to respond to a person legally deprived of their original identity. Things like an amended birth certificate or a sealed biological record, they just don't exist in this curriculum. The audit leaves absolutely no room for doubt. It's undeniable proof. Identity continuity isn't just low, it is actively categorized as a critical risk. We are living in a post-tragic reality, guys, where this massive rights failure is no longer just an anecdotal complaint. It's an actively measurable, rigorously documented, and costed governance failure. So how does this actually play out in real life? Let's map how this systemic data translates to intimate human harm across a lifetime. In early childhood, you've got an educator applying standard developmental tools to an adoptee child, totally unaware that the child's developmental baseline is structurally different. Then, in individual support, a worker might log a participant's completely understandable identity fragmentation distress as just behavioral issues. Fast forward to aged care, and a worker has no framework whatsoever to support a woman at the end of her life who is panicking, not because of her health, but because she doesn't have access to her own original birth certificate.
And that brings us to Section 3, the Architecture of Silence.
You really have to ask, how does a gap this devastating remain completely unquestioned? Well, the investigation defines this as the architecture of silence. It's basically a design failure that's distributed so evenly across so many different agencies like a giant puzzle that no single hand is obliged to put the pieces together and repair it. We aren't just talking about a single sealed adoption file here. This is wholesale curriculum erasure, perfectly ensuring that a 3 million strong workforce treats a person's severed origin as completely outside their scope of care.
Let's break down how this bureaucratic machinery works in practice, because it's wild. Every single agency involved can truthfully disclaim responsibility. Human Ability writes the package, sure, but only to ministerial standards. The Department of Employment funds and endorses it, but they don't write the actual units. ASCA regulates how the training is delivered, but not the content itself. Jobs and Skills Australia? They study workforce capacity, not identity rights. And the Children's Commissioner can advise, but they literally cannot compel a change. So the silence is maintained by absolutely everyone, and therefore by no one.
Section 4. The maintenance economy.
Now we need to look at how this distributed silence doesn't just sit there statically. It is continually funded and actively reproduced, cycle after cycle. The investigation calls this the maintenance economy. That $54.5 million grant we talked about earlier, it's not funding some grand conspiracy. What it does is fund steering committees and technical consultations where the strict boundaries of workforce needs structurally exclude adoptee expertise entirely. The money maintains the exact conditions under which this omission is permanently ignored. It keeps the curriculum current without ever forcing it to actually see the issue.
And honestly, here is the brutal truth of the matter. Why hasn't this been fixed yet? Simply put, a workforce trained not to see the wound of severed origins is just easier to manage. Think about it. A worker who understands what was structurally taken from an adoptee asks harder questions. They require better records. They push back against smooth, easy bureaucratic forms. For the system as a whole, this structural blindness is just highly efficient.
All right, Section 5. Spreading the blind spot. Now here's where we really need to sound a warning. This institutionalized non-adoptive bias, it is not safely contained to just one vocational training sector. It's actively spreading and it's moving upward. Follow this timeline. In 2024, Jobs and Skills Australia ran a massive 37-member workforce capacity study that completely, entirely missed this identity gap. And by June 2026, the exact same commissioner who led that blind study is transitioning to head the new Australian Tertiary Education Commission, or ATEC. And ATEC's main goal is to harmonize vocational training and higher education into one seamless system.
So the logic goes upward, and the systemic risk here is absolutely massive. A vocational training logic that is fundamentally and demonstrably blind to identity rights is right now becoming the template for fusing and harmonizing the entire Australian tertiary education system. The omission isn't shrinking, it's spreading.
Which leads us finally to Section 6, the open window.
We've done the autopsy, so now let's pivot to the urgent, actionable opportunity unfolding right this second. This is the open window. That foundational early childhood qualification, the one that scored a dismal 22.8, it isn't a static document. It's under active review. It is literally being rewritten right this very moment in mid-2026. That means this gap is no longer a permanent, untouchable feature. It's an open question sitting on someone's screen right now.
And guess what? The system can no longer claim ignorance. 5 rigorous audit submissions have just landed on 5 different bureaucratic desks simultaneously. By putting the exact same forensic finding in front of the council, the department, the regulator, the workforce authority, and the commissioner all at once, the bureaucracy is trapped. They can't pass the buck anymore. Active observability has been forced upon them.
Which brings us to this incredibly piercing insight from the source text. The blankness was always a choice, dressed as an accident. Now the accident has been costed. The gap is now a highly visible, undeniable, mathematically costed choice. Renewing it today is a fully conscious decision by the very people whose names are on the funding line.
So the ultimate question we're left with is this. Will the system choose to close the window on identity rights for yet another funding cycle, or will they finally teach the workforce to see? I absolutely urge you to read the full forensic essay, dig into all the data for yourself over at thoughtlessdad.substack.com. Because really, what happens when a system is finally forced to look at its own silence? Thanks for joining me for this explainer.